This is video 29 of the Python beginner tutorial series. We're in module 7. We're discussing the benefits of using FastAPI with Flet. In module 6, you've already learned how to deploy a Flet application to fly.io with Uvicorn. And the application is running as a web application. So why do we need FastAPI? Our previous applications didn't use FastAPI. And in fact, the code is going to be simpler because there's no HTTP layer. You can make a function to directly be used by the UI within the same file or separate files. And within the same application, you could simply have two files, let's say. If you want to have a more standard architecture and then call it directly. However, if you choose to use the more complex architecture with FastAPI, you're going to have better separation of concerns. So separation of concerns is maybe not just the UI and the API backends or the front end and the back end files, but you could have many more structure with FastAPI. Perhaps more importantly, the API is reusable. So if you create a API backend to your front end UI, you could change the UI in the future. Example, you could move from Flet to a mobile app with Swift, with Flutter, with Android. You could also swap it out for something with React, with Vue, or one of these other frameworks. For our learning purposes, the division between a back-end framework and a front-end UI is closer to the standard web patterns that you might use. So it's important to focus on the patterns and not just the specific technology of like React or Angular or Vue. How is it architected? Direct functions are a bit more difficult to debug and to test, and it'll also limit the flexibility of a production application in the future. So not so important for learning, and in fact, we're going to focus on the direct functions for learning, but for a production application, it does make it more flexible. With FastAPI, the separation of concerns involves a UI layer written in Flet, but it could be a different technology, such as React or Vue or Flutter. Then there's an API layer which we're building on FastAPI, which will then handle the business logic in a set of Python applications. In a direct function, we can jam everything, all the Python code, to create the UI layer and the business logic into the Flet application itself. But they're mixed together in this one application, and thus it's harder to get it organized. If we separate the concerns out more clearly, we can test each layer separately. Again, this does add complexity, and so for a simple app, like we're going to cover in these tutorials, you normally don't need this separation of concerns at this level. However, it's more common, especially as the application gets more complex. In addition to the testing it separately, you can also change the UI and leave your backend logic untouched. You could have multiple UIs. So example, you could use Flutter for a television or a mobile app, a automotive type of interface to it with a touch screen. You could use React for the web, Vue for the web. And it's a clearer organization which will help you and your colleagues work on the same application. Use FastAPI. You automatically get an API that is exposed, and you could connect it to a Flet web app, which we're going to cover, a Flet mobile app, a React Vue frontend, which would be more common, mobile native apps, such as using Swift or Kotlin. So Swift would be for iOS and Kotlin would be for Android. Other services, you could connect it to other things as well, like another backend server to pull from your database or third-party integrations. If you use direct functions, it's much faster, it's much easier, it's quicker to build, but it's going to be locked into your Flet application and tightly coupled, which it may not be a bad thing. It depends on what you want to do. We're just giving you options in this course. FastAPI teaches you RESTful API design and also HTTP methods, the big ones being get, post, put, and delete. Request response patterns. So these are all very common concepts that we're going to introduce you to. Automatic API documentation from FastAPI, and it's closer to how real web app works in production systems and more useful for your job. The direct functions will teach you Python function calls. The knowledge is less transferable, but it's quicker to learn concepts such as data structures or other like basic Python functionality which you will need for your classes or for a job interview. This type of architecture will allow you to build tests independently. You can run tests either with something like curl, for example, and see how the business logic is working and is independent of your UI. If it's just one Flet application, the testing and debugging, you have to test it through the Flet UI. Click on some buttons. There's no obvious way to make the tests and the functions more automated, although it is possible with Python, but it's harder to separate out. And there's no automatic API documentation for the business logic. FastAPI is more modular, so you can add a module for authentication, authorization, a service for rate limiting, maybe caching. You can scale the API independent of the application. You can move it to a separate server. You can add versioning to the business logic that is separated out from the UI and integrate with other services, so like another server. If it's direct functions, it will require significant refactoring and you must rebuild the architecture. So there's a lot of negatives about direct functions, but the reality is that it's easier and it's quicker to focus in on the Python components. So if you set up this type of front-end, back-end system with FastAPI, there's a lot of benefits, but there is more setup. It's much more complex. There's also different conceptual things you'll have to get used to with FastAPI. The direct functions, so a direct function is you have a Python function that has your business logic, it's in the same app, and your Python main function will just call it up and use it. The performance is slightly faster with direct functions. With an API call, there is an overhead where it has to contact the API server. And there may be issues if the API server is maybe on a different network or something. With an API access with FastAPI, you can have multiple clients. With direct functions, it's one app only, which is great if you're only building one app. There's no problem. The testing is done independent, or it can be done independently of the business logic and the UI. For Flet, if it's just the Flet application alone, you have to test it through the UI. And you're learning web patterns. For Flet, you're learning Python primarily. You're not learning a specific industry pattern, although there are some components of it which are very much like a full stack, but it is less transferable. If you're building a desktop application, like we are for most of the tutorials in the class, it's better to use Flet. It's easier. There is no desktop version with FastAPI. It has to be a server process. If you want everything in one process, it's simpler. Or if you don't need a complex web deployment, and like for example, for most of the course, the tutorials, it's not about web deployment. You're learning parts of Python. If you're focused on simple tools, scripts, and learning, internal tools, quick prototypes, and you don't need the API for the business logic, it's probably better just to use Flet. Using the direct functions will make the app slightly faster It's not that much overhead, but there is some. If you have a lot of high frequency operations, or if you can't afford the HTTP overhead. We're focused on this module because it does touch on the web development patterns that you're more likely to see in the future. There's more transferable skills. You may want to use this type of pattern for future projects, and it's industry standard. If you're learning Python, probably the direct functions are simpler. If you want to build desktop apps, it's going to be simpler just to use Flet alone with the direct functions. Simple tools, it's better to use Flet. Complex web apps that are especially under high scale, FastAPI is better. Full stack job prep, FastAPI is closer to industry architectures, and we do have a separate course on FastAPI. Next video, we'll quickly review the setup and installation of our development environment.